Let the salt of the Dead Sea begin to settle on the back of your tongue. And let the desert wind move through this room as a thing already older than your name. Somewhere in the deep blue hour before a particular sunrise, a 1,000-year-old city sleeps along a circular plain of soft black soil and date palms. The watchmen on the high mud brick walls do not yet know it, but the sky above them has already changed color in a way the human eye was never built to read. There is a hush moving over the orchards. The animals in the pens have stopped chewing. The morning birds have not begun. And out beyond the hills of Moab, the upper atmosphere has started to glow with a soft, terrible gold, as if a second, dimmer sun were being kindled behind the clouds. You are very far from that hour now. You are lying in a quiet room, in a soft bed, in a century those watchmen could never have imagined. And yet, for a little while tonight, I want to take you back across the long, salted floor of those vanished centuries, and walk with you through the place that the world remembers as Sodom, and her sister city Gomorrah, and the smaller sisters, Admah and Zeboim, all of them sleeping together on the disk of land the Hebrews simply called the Kikar, the round, bright, well-watered plain, the lost circle of the Jordan. For more than 3,000 years, the story of these cities has come to us in two breaths at once. The first breath is short, almost prosecutorial, given by the priestly editors of Genesis. They say only that the Lord rained down sulfur and fire from heaven, that he overturned the cities and the plain and the inhabitants and all that grew from the ground, and that a single woman, looking back from the road, became a pillar of salt above the burning valley. The second breath is much longer, much stranger, and travels through the side passages of memory rather than the main hall. It moves through the watchers of Enoch, through the apocryphal letters of the early Christian world, through the Gnostic Codices buried in clay jars in the cliffs of Upper Egypt. It runs beneath the cuneiform tablets of Nineveh and the basalt black geology of the Dead Sea floor. It is this second, slower breath that we are going to follow tonight. So lower your shoulders. Loosen the small muscles along your jaw. Let the soft machinery of your day go quiet, and let your attention sink slowly toward the cadence of the words. The Hebrew Bible itself never quite lets the memory of the cities rest. In Deuteronomy, the land of the Kikar is described as ground burned out by sulfur and salt, ground on which nothing can be planted and nothing can sprout. In the prophet Zephaniah, the same valley is reduced to weeds and salt pits, a wasteland reaching to the end of human time. In the wisdom of Solomon, it becomes a continually smoking expanse of ruin, marked by the silent figure of the salt pillar, still standing at the edge of the smoke. These are not the words of a single afternoon. These are the words of a wound that the landscape itself refused to close. And then, almost shyly, hidden inside one of the harshest of the prophetic books, the prophet Ezekiel turns the entire story sideways. He says that the true offense of Sodom was pride, in abundance of bread, in prosperous ease, in the cold, indifferent failure to care for the poor and the needy at the gates. The fire from the sky, in his telling, was never pointed at one narrow vice alone. It was pointed at a whole society that had grown so comfortable inside its own walls that it could no longer see the suffering pressed against them. In this small, almost forgotten passage is the seed of every later interpretation that has been buried, smoothed over, or quietly rewritten by the institutions that came after. Because this is the part of the lore the modern listener is rarely told. The Sodom story you may have grown up with, if you grew up with it at all, is a heavily edited survivor. Behind it stand the watchers of the Book of Enoch, the strange flesh of the letter of Jude, the heretical Gospels found in a buried jar at Nag Hammadi in the year 1945. Behind it stand the Akkadian poems of the god Era, the Sumerian laments for ruined city walls, the Canaanite arrows of the fire god Resheph, and the lioness Sekhmet drinking a flooded plain of red Egyptian beer. Behind all of it stands the geology of the Dead Sea itself, a salt-thick basin pulling slowly apart along a tectonic seam, leaking bitumen, breathing sulfur, holding the memory of fire in its bedrock. Tonight, in the slow, dark hours before sleep, we are going to enter that hidden corridor of the story together. We are going to walk through the suppressed texts and the buried scrolls. We are going to stand on the eastern edge of the Kikar at dawn, at noon, and at the unrepeatable moment the sky above it tore open. We are going to listen to the way the ancient mind tried to make peace with a fire that should not have been possible. And we are going to sit, slowly and without any fear at all, with the strange, beautiful idea that this story may have been hiding far more than a single sin all along. So close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let the salt yellow stillness gather along the inside of your eyelids. And come with me, very gently, to the disk of the Jordan in the years before the burning. Long before the fire fell over the cities of the plain, the lore of the Apocrypha tells us that another, older transgression was already unfolding far to the north. To understand why the sky finally tore open over the Kikar, we have to walk first to the cold, snowbound peaks of Mount Hermon on the high northern border of the land. Imagine a mountain of pale limestone and dark cedar lifting 9,000 feet above a country whose lower valleys still glow green in the spring. The summit holds its snow even in the dry season. The wind there is thin, sharp, edged with cold mineral air. The shepherds who graze their flocks on the lower slopes have always known the place as a kind of border. Beneath it lies the warm earth of human time. Above it lies a quieter, older country where the sky lowers itself onto the rock and seems to listen. It is here, in the lore of the Book of Enoch, that 200 celestial beings called the Watchers are said to have descended in the long generations before the flood. They came down by night onto the high snowfield of Hermon, swearing a covenant among themselves, binding their own number with a mutual oath so that none could later turn away from what they were about to do. They had come, the lore tells us, because they had looked down upon the daughters of men from the windows of the upper sky and had grown soft with longing. They had grown weak with the desire to cross a boundary that had been drawn by an older hand than theirs. And on the snow of that mountain, they crossed it. Lower your shoulders now and breathe in the cool, mineral air of a plain that no longer exists. A basin where all the maps of yesterday have already turned to ash. Settle in. The Watchers are not the end of this thread. They are the beginning of why a fire would later fall on a city you have never visited, in a country whose borders have changed 100 times since. Their leader, in the older traditions, is a fallen one named Asael, who in some manuscripts is rendered Azazel. He is described not as a soft tempter, but as a teacher of forbidden craft. He gave humanity the smelting of metals, the working of swords and shields, the cosmetics that made the eyes of women glitter, the spells of root and stone, the reading of clouds, and the courses of the planets. The other Watchers gave their own gifts. One taught the cutting of charms. One taught the patterns of the moon. One taught the calling up of names that should never have been spoken aloud. And the world that had been quiet under the slow hand of its creator now began to roar with weapons, with cosmetics, and with the cold metallic song of forbidden craft. The judgment, when it came, was strange and quiet. The archangels did not strike Asael where he stood. They bound him hand and foot, the lore says, and dragged him across the dry land to a place called the Desert of Dudael. There they cast him into a chasm of jagged rocks, deep below the surface of the earth, and they covered him over with darkness so complete that no sound could enter and no light could escape. He was to wait there, the texts say, until the day of the great burning, when his crimes would be answered fully. And this is the small, terrible blueprint that the apocryphal mind would later lay over the destruction of the cities of the plain. A boundary crossed, a cosmic surgery, a place sealed in fire and stone. Now feel the way the centuries begin to fold. The watchers have been bound. The flood has come and gone. Generations have passed across the earth, and the Hebrew scribes have settled into the long work of remembering. And then, in the small letter of Jude in the early Christian scripture, the two stories are quietly stitched together in a single sentence. Jude writes that the angels who did not keep their proper place were chained in gloomy darkness for the day of judgment. And then, in the very next breath, he writes that Sodom and Gomorrah did the same, indulging in what he calls strange flesh. They are set as two examples of the same offense. The watchers and the cities of the plain become, in the slow current of apocryphal memory, two iterations of one cosmic transgression, a line that should not have been crossed, a boundary that broke twice, a judgment that fell from the same direction in the sky. The strange flesh of which Jude speaks is not the small private failing the later church would imagine. In the older mind, it is a structural offense. It is the boundary between dimensions cracking open. It is the heavenly descending into the earthly, or the earthly reaching upward into the heavenly, in such a way that the careful architecture of creation begins to slip on its hinges. And when that boundary breaks, the Apocrypha tells us, the cosmos itself answers with quarantine, fire, salt, the sealing of a place beneath stone, the slow conversion of a green plain into a sterile bowl of glass. So the burning of Sodom, in this hidden line of memory, is not really about one small city. It is about the second time a wall between worlds was breached. It is about the universe, with the slow, weary patience of an old surgeon removing an infection from its own tissue. And the people of the plain, like Asael chained in the desert of Dudael, are the small, soft witnesses to a punishment far older than themselves. A punishment first prepared on a snow-covered mountain by 200 beings who had once chosen, on a single night of mineral wind, to come down. A punishment that had been waiting through every season, through every harvest, through every generation, for the second wall to fall. In the year 1945, in the dry red cliffs of Upper Egypt, near the small modern town of Nag Hammadi, a peasant farmer digging for fertilizer struck the lid of a buried clay jar. He hesitated before opening it. The desert had a long memory of jinn and of curses, and an unmarked vessel buried beneath a stone could hold either gold or grief. He chose in the end to break the seal. Inside that jar, wrapped in leather and wading through more than 1,500 years of silence, lay 13 leather-bound codices of papyrus, written in the soft Sahidic dialect of Coptic, copied by monastic hands sometime in the 4th century after Christ. These codices were the buried gospels of a tradition the Orthodox Church had spent centuries trying to erase. Within their pages were unfamiliar names and unfamiliar cosmologies. The Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit. and two strange scrolls in particular that we will sit with tonight: the Revelation of Adam and the Paraphrase of Shem. These two texts do something almost unthinkable to the Sodom story. They turn it inside out. They take the Genesis narrative of righteous fire from heaven and reread it as the rage of a jealous, second-rate God, frightened of the spark of higher knowledge held by the very people he intended to burn. Picture for a moment the small library cell of a Coptic monk in the 4th century, bent over a sheet of papyrus the color of weak honey. The lamp flame is low. The silence around him is the silence of a desert monastery, where the only sound is the wind moving along the walls of pale red rock outside. He is copying a text that his bishop has already condemned, knowing that within a generation the same text will be ordered burned across the empire. He copies it anyway. He folds the finished pages into a leather binding, slips them into the jar, and seals the lid with pitch. Then he buries the jar beneath a stone, and he trusts the dry sand to hold it until a kinder age can come and read what he has saved. Let your hands grow heavy as the bitumen of that drowned valley, and let the centuries fold quietly around you like dark wool. Drift now into the strange architecture of the Gnostic mind. There, the maker of this material world is not the highest God at all. He is a lesser entity named Sakla, or Yaldabaoth, or simply the Demiurge, a blind and arrogant craftsman who fashioned matter as a kind of trap, a finely woven prison for sparks of higher consciousness that had wandered down from the true and unknown source above him. In this hidden cosmology, the people of Sodom are not depraved. They are something rarer and more dangerous. They are described as carriers of the imperishable seed, the lineage of Seth, the faint but unkillable memory of a higher light planted inside human flesh. The demiurge, in his small, paranoid mind, recognizes that seed inside them. He feels the frequency of it as a physician might feel a fever in a patient he cannot cure. And so, in the Gnostic retelling, the fire from heaven over the cities of the plain is not divine justice at all. It is the panicked outburst of a lesser God trying to put out a light older than himself. In the Revelation of Adam, the moment of the burning is described with a strange and luminous tenderness. As the fire begins to fall over Sodom and Gomorrah, 3 radiant figures descend from the higher reaches of the cosmos. They are named Abrasax and Sablo and Gamaliel. They move through the smoke without being burned. They lift the people who carry the imperishable seed up out of the chaos, away from the burning streets, away from the falling walls, away from the choking ash. They carry these enlightened ones into a country above the fire, where the demiurge cannot follow them. In the Paraphrase of Shem, it is stated even more bluntly that Sodom was destroyed unjustly, and that its people were teachers of universal wisdom who kept clear consciences to the very end. Now feel the strangeness of this for a moment. The story you may have been taught in childhood is one of clear moral logic. A wicked city, a righteous fire, a single family rescued by torchlight. The story buried in the clay jar at Nag Hammadi is the same scene played in reverse. A city of hidden seekers, a jealous and small-minded creator. A rescue performed not by his angels, but by emissaries from a country above his reach. 3 luminous beings, a descent, a lifting away. You can begin to understand why such a text was buried. To the bishops of the early consolidating church, this was not merely a different reading of an old scene. It was a complete rejection of the cosmic order they were trying to build. If the God of the burning was a small and frightened tyrant, then every act of judgment in the older scriptures became suspect. The flood, the plagues, the fire over the plain. all of it became the violence of a warden, not the discipline of a father. To preserve the soft, ordered universe of Orthodox theology, these scrolls had to be removed from the conversation. They were condemned. They were hunted. And in the case of the Nag Hammadi monk, they were secretly buried in a jar beneath a stone, where they would sleep through the rise and fall of empires, until a man with a hoe in his hand would crack them open by accident in the middle of the 20th century. And so, in this hidden line of memory, the cities of the plain are not the villains of the story. They are the casualties of a much older war, fought between two ranks of gods. The lower god, who claims this world as his property, and the higher mind above him, who keeps sending small, unkillable sparks of itself down into the prison of matter, century after century, even when the fire falls, even when the cities burn, even when the small clay jar is buried beneath a stone, and the monk who carried it goes back, slowly, to his cell. Long before the Coptic monk closed his jar in the Egyptian sand, and long before the priestly editors of Genesis sat down to compose the verses we now know, the Mesopotamian world had already been rehearsing the lore of fire and ruin for more than 1,000 years. To follow this thread, we have to drift now from the dry red cliffs of Upper Egypt across the great northern arc of the desert into the alluvial plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Picture a low country of mud and water, date palm groves leaning across slow brown canals, cities built up on artificial mounds of brick because the river will sometimes try to take them back. The horizon is wide, the summer sky is heavy with haze, and rising above the flat-roofed houses, painted in dark tiers of indigo and bone-white plaster, stand the great ziggurats of Babylon and Ur and Eridu, stepped pyramids of unfired brick whose high summits carry small painted shrines for gods who are old enough to no longer need to explain themselves to anyone. Sink deeper now into the soft brown silt of two rivers that have been carrying this story longer than any tongue you have ever heard, and let the slow water pull you further from the lit edges of your own day. The men and women of these cities have already learned how the gods speak. They speak in flood. They speak in plague. They speak, sometimes, in a single quiet sentence handed down by a priest who has just risen from the smoke of a temple lamp. And in the long literary memory of this country, two particular poems lay the deep groundwork for the eventual story of Sodom. The first is the Akkadian poem of Era and Isham. Era is also Nergal, the dark god of plague, of war, of the underworld. He is not a tempter. He is not a teacher. He is a force of pure entropic violence, sleeping in the shadowed corners of the cosmos until something stirs him. In the poem, Era grows lethargic. He grows bored. He grows quietly sick of the loud, prosperous, well-fed world of human beings going about their small commerce beneath him. And without any neat moral provocation, without any single named sin, he decides to destroy Babylon and the surrounding cities. Not because they have offended him, simply because it is in his nature to ruin a place, and he has been still for too long. The second poem is older still. It is the Atrahasis epic, a story of the great flood that predates Noah by many generations. In this telling, the gods do not rise up against humanity for any specific transgression of the moral law. They rise up because the noise of human beings, the constant low hum of human existence, has grown too loud. The Akkadian word is huburi, a word that means clamor, racket, the busy hum of a species that will not quiet down. The senior god Enlil is unable to sleep. He calls the council of the gods together, and the eradication protocol is set in motion against the entire human race, not for what they have done, but simply for the sound that they make. Now feel how strange this groundwork is when you set it gently under the Genesis story. In Genesis 18, the Lord descends to the plain because, in his own words, the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has grown great and has reached him. The Hebrew word for that cry is za'akat, and it sits in the same linguistic family as the Akkadian huburi. It is the same conceptual water, a noise that rises from the earth, a heaviness in the upper air, a divine ear that finally turns downward to listen. And then, in Genesis 19:28, the patriarch Abraham looks out from a high ridge over the burning plain. The Hebrew verb used for the way the Lord first surveyed the cities before deciding to overturn them is wayashkep, to look down, to bend the gaze from above, to fix the long, cold attention of the divine upon a small, glittering city far below. That same verb, that same posture, sits in the Akkadian poem of Era. The destroyer god looks down upon the plain of Babylon from his elevation. He calculates the geometry of his coming violence. He measures the city in a single gaze, and then, having measured, he sweeps it away. The parallel is so close that scholars have argued, gently and with great care, that the Hebrew authors of Genesis were working with the same regional grammar of divine destruction that the Akkadian poets had already polished 1,000 years earlier. The Sodom narrative is not a borrowing of one specific pagan story. It is a child of an entire shared ancient grammar, in which the gods bend their gaze, the earth grows loud, the cities grow comfortable, and the answer that comes from above is fire and ruin. This is the slow, half-buried fact of the story. The fire over the Kikar did not arrive in a void. It arrived in a world whose imagination had been preparing for divine destruction for centuries already. The poets of Babylon had practiced it. The hymn singers of the great ziggurats had practiced it. The scribes of the lower river had carved it onto clay tablets and stored it in temple archives, where the dry heat of the desert preserved them long after the cities themselves had been worn down to mounds of soft brown dust. So when the editors of Genesis finally take up their reed pens and begin to write the verses about a smoking plain and a backward glance, they are not inventing a new horror. They are inheriting an old one. They are taking the long Mesopotamian habit of imagining annihilation and folding it into the strict moral grammar of a covenantal God. And the listener of their verses, sitting beside an oil lamp in some Iron Age village, was already half prepared for the picture they painted, because that picture had been moving through the air, through the rivers, through the language itself, for as long as any human mouth could remember. From the long brown rivers of the Mesopotamian plain, the lore of fire moves westward now, across the ridges of the anti-Lebanon mountains, into the warm, broken country of the Levant. This is the home of the Canaanites, the Hebrews' nearest religious neighbors and their oldest theological adversaries. To picture this landscape, imagine low limestone hills covered in scrub oak and wild olive, dry valleys glinting with white stones, and shrines built into the natural cracks of the rock, where small painted figurines of bronze and clay watch the road from cliff to cliff. Imagine a coastline of soft lapis water, a sky bleached almost colorless by midsummer heat, and the faint salt smell of the Mediterranean carried inland on the long evening winds. The Canaanites had their own pantheon, older in some ways than the Hebrew one, with its own thunder gods and its own healers, its own grain mothers and its own night demons. And among the most feared of these older deities was Resheph, the lord of plague and flame. He is described in the Ugaritic tablets and remembered in scattered fragments all the way down to Hellenistic Cyprus. He is a slim, dark figure carrying a bow, with the head of a gazelle rising from his crown. He is the bringer of fevers that empty whole villages in a single summer. He is also, in the older Semitic poetry, the sender of flaming arrows from the sky, the small, bright streaks of unexpected lightning that fall, in the dry season, on a single house and burn it down to ash before the neighbors can run for water. Let your breathing slow until it matches the small, patient breathing of a country that has already finished happening. And let the lamp inside the back of your mind dim by another careful notch. The Canaanites believed that the sudden firestorms of the Levantine summer were the literal weapons of Resheph. They believed that lightning was his arrow. They believed that the smell of brimstone after such a strike was the breath that hung from the tip of his bow. And the desolate, salt-blistered country of the Dead Sea region, with its sulfurous fissures and its black bitumen seeps, was understood across the older Semitic world as a country he had visited many times. Now listen carefully to what the Hebrew text quietly does with this. In the poetic books of Habakkuk and of Job, in the hot, image-rich verses where the language of the Canaanites still shows through the seams of the Hebrew, the sparks that fly upward from a fire are called B'nai Resheph, the children of Resheph, the little burning sons of the older fire god, still moving through the new theology like inherited ash. And in the Sodom story, when the Lord rains down sulfur and fire from the sky, every Canaanite hearer would have understood, on a subconscious level, that the weapons being used were the very weapons their grandfathers had attributed to Resheph. The Hebrew narrative does not deny those weapons, it simply reassigns them. It strips Resheph of his name, it strips him of his bow. It folds his sparks and his arrows quietly into the inventory of the Lord, and then it lets him fade away into the silence of the older country, like a name being slowly written out of a family ledger. This is one of the half-told facts of the story. The fire that fell on Sodom and Gomorrah is not, in the older imagination, a brand new weapon at all. It is an old weapon, stripped from the hands of a defeated god and now wielded by the new one. From the dry coast of Canaan, the lore moves further west again, across the desert and the Sinai land bridge, into the long green ribbon of Egypt. Here the fire takes a different face. It does not fall as arrows from the sky. It walks the earth as a lioness. In the Book of the Heavenly Cow, an Egyptian funerary text inscribed on the inner walls of certain royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the aging sun god Re grows tired of humanity. He senses, from his slow, weary throne above the desert, that the small populations of the lower river have begun to plot against him. They have grown ungrateful. They have grown loud. They have grown soft inside their fertile country. Re does not strike them himself. Instead, he calls forth the goddess Hathor, the gentle cow mother, the patron of music and of love. He breathes his command into her ear, and in that moment, Hathor transforms. Her soft cow shape splits open, her shoulders thicken, her face elongates into the long, hot face of a lioness. She becomes the goddess Sekhmet, whose name means simply the powerful one, and she descends upon the human race with a violence so complete that the Egyptian text describes her as wading through pools of human blood up to her knees. The slaughter is so absolute that Re himself begins to grow alarmed. He realizes that if Sekhmet is allowed to continue, there will be no humanity left to worship him. He acts. He commands his servants to brew 7,000 great jars of barley beer, and he orders that the beer be dyed deep red with ochre from the cliffs of Aswan. The beer is poured out across the fields of the lower Nile in a single night until the entire valley resembles a vast, shimmering sea of blood beneath the moon. Sekhmet, drawn by the scent of what she believes to be more carnage, comes down to drink. She drinks deeply. She drinks until her terrible head grows heavy. And at last, drunk on the false blood of her own bloodthirst, she falls asleep on the riverbank, and the slaughter ends. Now feel how the picture connects. In the Egyptian myth, a deity decides to incinerate a region. The region is reduced to scorched earth and red mud. The slaughter ends only by trickery, with a flooded plain glittering darkly under the night sky. And in the morning, the patriarch Abraham, in the Genesis story so far away, gazes down from his ridge over the valley of Siddim and sees only the dense smoke of a vast furnace rising from a sterilized plain. The same picture, the same aftermath, the same long, weary horizon of a country that has been visited by something it could not survive. Now we step out of the older mythologies and walk forward, very slowly, to the place where the lore meets the soil, to the actual mound in the actual valley, to the ruined city the modern world has come to call Tall el-Hammam. Tall el-Hammam rises today as a low oval hill on the eastern edge of the Jordan Disk, about 10 miles northeast of the modern shoreline of the Dead Sea. From a distance, in the late afternoon, it looks like nothing remarkable. A long mound of dust-colored earth, tufted here and there with dry brush, with the distant blue line of the Salt Sea visible past its western flank. But within that quiet mound lie the remains of a Middle Bronze Age city that, by the most generous archaeological estimates, once supported a population in the tens of thousands. The lower walls of mud bricks still survive in places, fused together in dense, ash-choked layers. The foundations of monumental buildings still trace the lines of streets. The exterior rampart, the great defensive wall that ringed the upper city, may once have stood more than 20 meters above the valley floor. And running beneath all of it, in a thick black band roughly 5 feet deep, lies a single layer of destruction so violent that some researchers have spent the last 20 years trying to explain how, in the world of 3,500 years ago, a city of this scale could have been killed in less than a single breath. Let your jaw rest. Let your hands rest. Let the long salt of the Jordan Valley pull the small worry of your day down through the floor and out into the older silence beneath this room. Picture the city in the hour before its destruction. It is roughly the year 1650 before the Common Era. The walls of Tall el-Hammam are pale gold in the early morning sun, the bricks the color of raw honey, the high parapets dotted with small dark figures, watchmen wrapped in undyed wool. Below the walls, the orchards run for miles in soft green rows, almonds and figs and date palms growing in the rich black silt of the kikar. Donkeys move slowly along the canals. Smoke rises in thin white columns from the houses, where women are baking the morning bread on heated stones. Children play in the dust between the storehouses, and somewhere, high above all of this, an object no one yet knows is coming has already entered the upper atmosphere. In the modern reconstruction, that object is a stony asteroid roughly 50 meters across, traveling at a speed that no terrestrial language can comfortably hold. It has come down out of the deep dark, falling on a long, shallow trajectory through the upper sky, the friction of the air beginning to glow against its leading edge. To the watchmen on the walls, the first sign is a small, hard star burning where no star should be. They squint at it. They do not yet move. The star grows, the star drops, and in a span of seconds, the small bright point swells into a long, terrible white tongue of fire, crossing the entire morning sky, faster than the eye can track, brighter than the sun. Because of its angle of entry, the object does not strike the ground. It detonates in the dense lower atmosphere, several kilometers above the city, in a single instant of incomprehensible release. The temperature at the surface of the Kikar spikes past 2,000 degrees Celsius, a heat closer to the surface of a small dim star than to anything else the human imagination has measured. The mud brick walls of the city, thick walls that have stood through generations, do not crack. They do not topple. They are, in a single fraction of a second, sheared cleanly off their stone foundations and turned into a horizontal cloud of dust traveling outward at hypervelocity speeds. Inside the city, there is no time to be afraid. There is no time even to look up. Human bodies do not burn in any familiar sense. They are simply unmade. Bone fragments fuse, in the same instant, into the shards of the broken pottery beside them. The streets turn to glass. The grain stores vanish into vapor. The orchards beyond the walls flatten outward in concentric rings, the trees laid down in a single direction, like long brown hair combed flat against the earth by an unseen hand. And then, almost as a second wave, comes the silence. The flash dims. The shock wave passes outward. The atmosphere over the Kikar, for one long moment, simply hangs in stunned vacancy. Then a thick blanket of salt-heavy ash begins to fall. It comes down in fine gray flakes mixed with melted spherules of platinum, of iridium, of microscopic carbon diamonds formed by the heat. It coats the broken foundations. It covers the still glowing edges of pottery. It buries the orchards. It buries the canals. It buries the entire memory of a 1,500-year-old agricultural civilization beneath a soft gray blanket, and the hush that follows is the most complete hush this part of the world has ever known. Now feel the weight of this picture for a moment. The whole event, from the first brightening of the impossible star to the falling silence of the ash, takes less than a minute. The city the watchmen had grown up in, the city their grandparents had grown up in, the city they had patrolled at dawn and at dusk for their entire lives, is simply gone. No body remains to bury, no wall remains to mourn. The Kikar is now a pale gray table beneath a thin gray sky, smelling of salt, of burned mineral, and of something deeper, a smell the surrounding villages will speak about for centuries afterward as a sign that the ground itself can be wounded by the heavens. It is important to say, gently, that this reconstruction is not settled science. The sharper edges of it have been argued and re-argued by impact specialists for many years now, and we will sit with those arguments later in the night. But even held loosely, even held only as a possibility, the picture is enough to explain why the survivors who came afterward, the people who walked across that gray table months and years later, told the story they told. A city overturned, sulfur and fire from the sky, a wasteland that would not return to green. The lore of Sodom may not be the literal record of an impact, but it may very well be the long, slow imprint of one upon the human memory of a place that could not afford to forget. Now we drift away from the burning plain itself and rise upward, very slowly, into the strange, paradoxical country the apocryphal mind imagined sitting just above the sky. To understand the full lore of why a fire could fall on a city, the older texts insist that we must first see the place from which that fire was prepared. And nowhere in the old literature is that place described with stranger geometry than in the Book of Enoch. In the 14th chapter of 1st Enoch, the patriarch is taken up out of his bed by a cold wind, lifted through layers of cloud and water and thin starlight, and brought to the threshold of a vast celestial palace. Picture it carefully. The outer walls of this palace are not built of stone or of metal. They are built of pure crystalline hailstones, packed together as if frozen mid-storm, with their hard, cold surfaces interlaced everywhere with circling tongues of moving liquid fire. The cold and the heat exist together inside the same wall, neither one melting the other, neither one cooling the other. The whole structure shimmers with that impossible balance, as if the boundaries between elements have softened and have agreed, inside this single architecture, to behave differently than they do anywhere else in creation. Settle now into the slow, weighted dark, where the small clock of your own breathing becomes the only timepiece left in the room. Drift further. The text says that Enoch passes through the ice and firewall and finds himself inside an inner court whose floor is paved with sheets of clear, polished glass. Lightning runs constantly along the floor without striking him. Above him, a second ceiling of fire opens, and through that ceiling he sees a still higher room. He moves toward it. He approaches a single throne, and the throne, the text says, appears to be carved from one solid piece of ice. Yet, from this seat of frozen crystal, an almost intolerable luminescence pours outward, the brilliance of a sun seen at its noon, somehow burning out of solid frost. From beneath the throne, vast rivers of flaming fire pour silently outward in all directions, forming a wide, slow delta of flame in the dark void of the upper sky. And there is a sound in this place. The text struggles for the words. It says the sound is like the noise of many waters, like a great, low rushing of wind, like a frequency so heavy and so deep that the ears alone cannot receive it, so the body itself begins to vibrate against it, the bones humming in sympathy, the small hairs of the arm lifting, the chest tightening with the awareness of having entered a place not built for human attention. Hold that picture for a moment, because it is the architecture from which Sodom's fire is said to have been sent. The cities of the plain were not destroyed, in this lore, by some far-off, comfortable god seated on a soft cloud. They were destroyed, the Apocrypha insists, by judgment issued from an inner room paved in glass and lightning, beneath a throne of ice that radiates the heat of a furnace. The fire that fell on the Kikar was, in the older imagination, simply a small overflow from the burning rivers that pour endlessly out of the foot of that throne. Now feel the second half of the geometry. If there is an ice and fire palace above the world, there is also, in the apocryphal mind, a corresponding emptiness beneath it. The opposite of the throne room is the abyss. And the abyss, in texts like the Apocalypse of Paul and the Apocalypse of Peter, is described with the same patient, uncomfortable detail as the room above. The abyss has no natural light. It is not even darkness in the simple sense of the absence of the sun. It is described as a darkness so heavy that it can be felt as weight on the skin. The fallen watchers, bound by the archangels, are kept here in chains of what the text calls gloomy gloom. Their bodies cannot move. Their voices cannot rise above the floor. And running through this lower country are rivers no living foot has ever crossed. There is the river of pitch, dark and slow, burning along its surface with a fire that does not consume the fuel beneath it. There is the river of sulfur, thicker and brighter, whose scent is the same scent that lingered over the burning plain of the Kikar. And there is the Acherusian lake, a wide and silent body of water that, in some traditions, the souls of the dead must cross before their judgment can be received. Above all of this, the texts add one more, almost unbearable detail. The Book of Enoch describes the horses of the heavenly host, the war mounts of the angels of judgment, wading through pools of blood up to their breasts as they ride. It is a single image, given without commentary, and the size of what it implies is what makes it heavy. The reader is asked, in the soft voice of the apocalyptic genre, to accept that the sheer volume of accumulated wrongdoing, when finally weighed, is a flood deep enough that the horses of the divine cavalry can swim in it. And moving through this entire lower country are the figures the apocryphal texts call the angels of punishment. They are not the soft-featured guardians of later painting. They are described as faceless, almost mechanical enforcers. They feel no sympathy. They feel no haste. They pass between the chained watchers and the rivers of pitch with the dispassionate steadiness of an old machine doing the work it was built to do. They are heralded not by light, but by the smell of brimstone, the smell that the survivors of the burning Kikar would have known on the wind for years afterward. Hold both pictures in your mind for a moment, very gently, before they fade. Above, the impossible palace of ice and fire, with its throne radiating the brightness of a sun that does not belong inside frost. Below, the dark, slow rivers of pitch and sulfur, the bound watchers in their gloomy gloom, the patient mechanical figures moving along the dim banks. Between the two, suspended in the small, soft middle, sits the world of human beings, the cities of the plain, the orchards along the canals, the watchmen on the walls of tall el-Hammam. Standing exactly between the burning throne and the abyss, inside the brief, fragile country in which a city can rise, can grow comfortable, can ripen into ease, and then can be unmade in less than a minute by a small, bright star falling out of the dark. Now let us sit, quietly and without fear, with what the lore of these cities actually means. We have walked through the burning plain. We have entered the throne room of ice and fire. We have descended into the abyss with its patient, faceless angels. And the question that hangs above all of it, like the slow gray dust still drifting down over the broken walls of the Kikar, is the question of what kind of universe permits such a thing in the first place. For the people of the ancient world, the answer was, in a way, almost a comfort. The fire fell because the cities had broken something. The boundary between heaven and earth had cracked. The cry of human prosperity had grown too loud. The hospitality due to wandering visitors had been refused at the gate. There was, in every old account, a reason, a logic, a divine accountant who had weighed the city in the slow scale of the upper sky and had found it wanting. To live inside such a story, even a frightening one, is to live inside meaning. And meaning, even harsh meaning, is one of the small, warm rooms the human mind builds for itself against the cold of the larger night. But the modern reconstruction of the Kikar event introduces, very quietly, another possibility. If the destruction of Tall el-Hammam was caused by an unscheduled visitor from the deep dark, by a stony asteroid that happened to enter the upper atmosphere on one particular morning, then no moral accounting was performed at all. The city was not weighed. The city was not judged. The city simply happened to be standing under a particular column of air on a particular sunrise, and the universe, with the cold indifference of a vast machine, swept it clean. 1,500 years of street life, of harvest cycles, of weddings and burials and small private sorrows, ended in less than a single minute, for no reason that any divine accountant could be held to. Let the small, restless attention of the day fall to the bottom of the room, like dust through deep water. And let your mind grow as wide and as quiet as the basin itself. This is the slow horror at the heart of the Sodom story when the airburst hypothesis is laid beneath it. The horror is not the fire. The horror is the indifference. The cosmos, in this reading, is not a courtroom. It is a quiet workshop, full of mechanical hazards moving along their slow, predictable orbits, none of which know that you exist, none of which slow down to consider whether the city beneath them has been kind to its poor or harsh to its travelers. The ancient mind, faced with such a possibility, did exactly what the human mind always does. It refused. It assigned a reason. It wrote a narrative of sin and judgment over the silent geometry of the impact, because to live without that narrative would have been to live inside an open mouth. There is a second philosophical reading, found inside the apocryphal texts themselves, that sits no less strangely on the heart. In this version, the fire was not the workshop of an indifferent solar system. It was a calculated act in a much larger conflict. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was a small theater in an ongoing war between cosmic ranks, between the bound watchers and the still loyal archangels, between the lower powers seeking to expand their reach into human flesh and the higher powers attempting to seal the boundaries of creation. The cities of the plain were caught between two armies, neither of which had any particular interest in them. They were not the cause of the war. They were simply the ground over which the war passed. And when one army moved decisively to contain the other, the cities were the soil upon which that containment was carried out. This is the second weight the lore quietly hangs around the listener's neck. In this telling, humanity is not the cherished center of creation. Humanity is the small, soft surface across which much larger powers conduct their disagreements, with no particular malice and no particular care. The fire from heaven becomes, in this reading, less a moral judgment and more an act of cosmic landscaping, the way a farmer might burn back a field of stubble at the end of the season, with the small lives in the stubble understood, if at all, only as collateral. And then, beneath both of these, there is the Gnostic version, which is in some ways the strangest of all. In the Gnostic reading, the fire was the act of a frightened lower god trying to put out the higher light he had, by accident, caught inside the people of the plain. In this version, the universe is not an indifferent workshop. It is not a battleground between cosmic ranks. It is a finely managed prison, governed by an architect who is afraid of what his prisoners might become if they were ever allowed to grow fully awake. The fire is not punishment. The fire is suppression. And the listener of such a tale is left with the most unsettling implication of all, which is that some of the cruelty of the world may not be moral at all, but simply the panic of a small administrator trying to keep his books in order. 3 readings. The indifferent universe. The cosmic war. The frightened warden. None of them is comforting. All of them sit in different ways with the same fundamental fact, which is that a city stood in a green disk along a river. And then, in less than the span of an exhaled breath, the city was not there anymore. The lore of Sodom is, at its deepest, a meditation on the smallness of human structures inside whatever the universe actually is. The walls were thick, the towers were high, the granaries were full, the watchmen were trained. None of it mattered. And here is the gentle truth that the older voice of this tradition keeps offering, beneath all the horror. The smallness of the city is not, finally, only a horror. It is also a kind of release. The ancient mind, having stared long enough at the burning plain, eventually came to understand that the human work of building, of buying, of accumulating, of fortifying, is held inside a much larger silence than any wall can keep out. To know this is to be afraid for a while, but to know it well enough, for long enough, is also to grow quieter, to stop clutching, to set down, very gently, the small, heavy stones of one's own day, and to lie down, as you are lying down right now, inside a room that is, for this hour, perfectly safe. There are, scattered along the long shoreline of this story, a handful of small, strange fragments that the mainstream tellings tend to leave behind. They sit in the side passages of the lore, the way odd objects sometimes sit on the lower shelves of a cabinet, half hidden behind larger pieces, picked up only by the visitor who is willing to bend down and look. Tonight, before we let the whole picture dissolve back into sleep, we should walk past a few of them, slowly, the way you would walk past the small displays in an empty museum at the end of the day. The first of these is the matter of the sulfur balls. Beginning in the late 20th century, an amateur archaeologist named Ron Wyatt traveled along the southern shore of the Dead Sea, collecting hundreds and eventually thousands of small spherical nodules of yellow sulfur embedded in the soft white marl of the cliffs above the saltwater. He held them up to the camera. He cracked them open. He claimed that they were 98% pure beta monoclinic sulfur, a crystalline form he argued could only have been produced by the unearthly heat of a divine firestorm raining down on the cities of the plain. For a generation of viewers, the small yellow stones became, on the strength of his enthusiasm, the closest thing to a physical relic of Genesis 19 that the modern world possessed. The geological reality is gentler and in some ways more interesting. Beta monoclinic sulfur does form at high temperatures, but it is highly unstable below 95.5 degrees Celsius and reverts, almost as a matter of habit, to ordinary orthorhombic sulfur within hours of cooling. The idea that a stable monoclinic form could survive in the open desert for 36 centuries is, in the most patient language of chemistry, simply impossible. What the cliffs of the Dead Sea actually contain is the slow, patient work of an entirely different kind of fire. The hypersaline waters of the late Pleistocene Lake Lisan, the salt-heavy ancestor of the modern Dead Sea, were exceptionally rich in microscopic anaerobic bacteria. These ancient bacteria, living without oxygen in the buried mud, fed on the dissolved sulfates of the lake floor and slowly produced, over thousands of years, tiny pure nodules of elemental sulfur as the byproduct of their breathing. The yellow stones in the cliffs are not the brimstone of Genesis. They are, more strangely, the fossilized exhalations of microscopic life that has been quiet for tens of thousands of years. Drift now to the soft underside of the lore, where the stranger fragments rest like fallen coins beneath shallow water, waiting to be picked up by anyone patient enough to look. The second fragment lies in the British Museum, in the form of a small 5-inch clay tablet, known to scholars only by its catalog number, K8538, but referred to in the older literature as the Nineveh planisphere. It was unearthed in the middle of the 19th century by Sir Austin Henry Layard, working through the buried lower chambers of the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The tablet itself is a circular astrolabe, divided into 8 wedges, copied around the year 700 before the Common Era from a much older Sumerian original. And the cuneiform inscriptions on its surface, when finally translated by a team of researchers at the University of Bristol, were found to describe an astronomical observation made by an unnamed Sumerian astronomer on one specific date, the 29th of June, in the year 3123 before the Common Era. The astronomer described, in dry administrative language, the descent of what he called a white stone bowl approaching, sweeping vigorously along the morning sky. It is not certain that this single observation has anything at all to do with Sodom. The dating, the geography, the trajectory have been argued and re-argued among specialists. But it does prove one quiet, important thing. The astronomers of the older Mesopotamian world were watching the sky carefully enough and writing down what they saw faithfully enough that the deep memory of large incoming objects was being preserved in the archives of the ziggurat libraries, long before any Hebrew scribe sat down to compose the verses of Genesis. The sky in the older world was being watched, and the watchers were taking notes. The third small fragment is hidden inside the Hebrew language itself. The Genesis text does not exactly call Sodom and Gomorrah the cities of the plain. That is the looser translation. The actual word the Hebrew uses is kikar, which literally means a disk, a flat round shape, or, by extension, a talent of precious metal. In Akkadian and Ugaritic, the word is never used for an ordinary linear valley. It is used for something specifically circular, and when applied to the geography of the Jordan, it points unmistakably to a particular round, well-watered alluvial fan along the eastern bank of the river, just north of where the fresh water turns into the dead salt of the lower sea. To stand on the highland ridges of Bethel and Ai, as Abraham and Lot are said to have stood in the older verses, and to look eastward is to see exactly that disk laid out below, like a soft green coin pressed into the dust of the desert. The text knows the shape of the land it is describing. The text has always known. The last fragment is more difficult, and we should hold it gently. The most famous modern article advancing the airburst hypothesis for Tall el-Hammam, published in the journal Scientific Reports in the year 2021, was formally retracted in the spring of 2025 after sustained criticism from impact specialists. The critics, led by a physicist named Mark Boslow, argued that the surface wind speeds attributed to the Tunguska blast in the original paper had been overstated by orders of magnitude, that the mineralogical evidence for shock had been misread, and that certain photographs of pottery alignments had been inappropriately cropped. The retraction does not erase the destruction layer at the site. It does not erase the burned mud brick or the melted pottery. It simply means that the specific cosmic airburst explanation, in its sharpest form, is not, at this present moment, scientifically secure. And so even the modern attempt to pin the lore down, to give it a clean, physical explanation, is itself still in motion. The argument continues. The papers are still being written. The fragments still rest, half illuminated on the lower shelves of the cabinet. The story refuses, even now, to settle into any single final shape, which is, perhaps, the most fitting fact of all about a tale that has refused to settle for more than 3,000 years. And now the cities are no more. The walls of Tall el-Hammam are dust beneath dust. The ziggurats of Babylon and Ur have softened back into the brown mounds the rivers gave them. The clay jar at Nag Hammadi sleeps in a museum case under low light. Even the argument over the airburst, which filled scientific journals only a year ago, has begun to soften into the long, calm patience of every older argument before it. The story keeps refusing to close, and that refusal, in the end, is its own kind of peace. You are still here. The room around you is small and warm. The walls are intact. No bright star is falling out of any sky over your roof tonight. You are lying in a soft bed, in a small, safe room, in a country that has, for tonight, been spared. The kikar is far away. The watchers are far away. The fire is far away. And the long weight of those vanished centuries is gently pulling you down. the way the salt of the Dead Sea pulls a swimmer to its surface and holds them there. If a single small question rises tonight, let it be this. What does a city sound like in the moment before it forgets that it was ever afraid? The heavy doors of the Apocrypha vault remain open. Whenever you wish to come back, the lamp inside will still be burning low. For now, let the salt yellow stillness of the Kikar settle over your eyes. Let your breath grow long and slow, and let the soft gray blanket of 3,500 years lay itself down across the small, careful country of your sleep.